Hey everyone, so continuing from the last time we stopped, we looked at sample sizes. We talked about how we cannot, in qualitative research, predetermine sample size unless you're using a quarter sample. Reason because we never quite know what we are collecting, or I should say, what would evolve or come out from the data that we collect. So we don't have a predetermined fixed number that we are looking for when we collect qualitative data. And so we go in and we interview people and try to hear different views and opinions, expressing different values and thoughts as we have read from the different kinds of sampling. As you recall, we talk about purposeful sampling, maximum variation sampling, and snowball sampling. So we never quite know how much we want to collect. We might have a ballpark number, but we also don't want to collect too much data because then, as we see in the last point, too much data can be paralyzing because when we have too much data, we are overwhelmed by too much to work on and we might miss the important things that's in the mix of a large amount of qualitative data. So that was where we were the last time, and moving forward to continue the last half of chapter 15. We look at this slide, starting from this slide, sampling and qualitative research. We start off saying that it's impossible for qualitative researchers to collect every data that we would like to. Ideally, we would love to capture as much of the complexity that we are studying or we are observing. We would love to spend as much time involved in the setting or the environment that we are studying. However, we know that it is practically not possible because it takes resources, time, all right? So for those reasons, we have to be more selective. We have to be selective. We choose how we collect and who we collect our data from. As we continue from here, you will notice that we talk about how we want to distinguish here on the third point, distinguish between routine, special, and untoward events. So one of those things, if you are following along in the textbook, you'll see on page 268, starting from 268 to 269, you see that a routine event is something that is a regular feature, something that happens routinely at a place. So in the example that we see from the book, it can be activities that people do at a certain location. So let's say again back to the example of studying behaviors at the cafeteria. Routine events will be probably a cashier standing behind the counter, ringing up people's purchases, people standing in line, getting ready to pay for their food, and people sitting around at tables, eating, talking with friends, checking emails, and things like that. So that can be a routine event or routine events, all right? So what would be a special event then? A special event is something that is out of the ordinary, is different than the routine event. So example we see from the book, it says that when the physicians are celebrating the birthday in this study that the author conducted, they celebrated the birthday in an intensive or critical care unit. So that's kind of unusual or less common because everyone only has one birthday a year. So only happens once a year is special. It doesn't happen every day. It's not routine. And they also gather at a rather interesting place, which is at a critical care unit. Most of us probably do not celebrate our birthdays that way. So that's a special event. The third kind of event that our author tells us is the untoward event. So what are examples of this kind of event? These are events where it was not planned and it emerged out of an emergency. It's unexpected. So something that's out of the blue. We didn't think that would happen. We didn't anticipate. We didn't expect it to happen, but it did. So in that sense, when an untoward event happens, you, the researcher or the qualitative researcher, has to make a decision whether do I want to stick to my original plan to collect data to study the environment that you have wanted to study, or do you switch gears, you turn your attention to that untoward event because it's so interesting, it's such a new event. So things that are prevalent today, as you know, say research that is ongoing in the last 2-3 months. Okay, so the researchers might have their own plans, what they want to study, the exact events they want to look at, people they want to interview. But in the last 2-3 months, you know that something changed and affected the world, and that's COVID-19. So researchers who say are working in an organization or in a hospital, things change because everyone is now not working at office. They might be working remotely at home, or they might be laid off. So then the qualitative researcher has to think, oh, okay, so this event that has happened, which is an untoward event, we didn't see this event coming. There's this pandemic. Do we shift gears and then shift our attention to study the effects of this untoward event, or do we continue to stay on track with what we originally wanted to study? So those are decisions that a qualitative researcher has to make as we progress through the research process. Now you remember that the qualitative research process is not as linear as the quantitative research process, and so we might make well, it's more acceptable to make those changes along the way in qualitative research as compared to quantitative research. Another point that the author tells us is that to sample qualitative data effectively and probably more representative of what we want to study, it might be a good idea to randomize the days or the times that you collect your data. So, for example, say I want to study behaviors at people's behavior at the cafeteria. I might want to conduct a few observations at say 8 a.m. Perhaps the cafeteria just open or not yet open. Maybe sometime at about 10 or 11 or 12, where there are more people coming into the cafeteria, people getting maybe say brunch or food for lunch, and maybe later on at 3 or 4 o'clock, maybe the crowd is much smaller. So when I sample different times throughout the day, it gives me a better sense of what happens at the cafeteria. Now the consumers' behaviors that is ongoing at the cafeteria throughout the day, rather than a specific instance like a very narrow window during the day. So that will be sampling in qualitative research. We don't want to be overly focused on an event or location or time, but at the same time, we don't want to be too lax, because if that's the case, then it's too broad, too general. We might end up not getting the data that we need to answer our original research questions. All right, so gaining access is something that's important. Remember that we talked about how the qualitative researcher can participate in research in 4 different ways. You recall that we talked about forms of participant observation. So we have the complete participant, we have the participant as observer, we have the observer as participant, and complete observer. So those 4 different categories give us different ways of observing the environment that we're studying. And when we have those categories, regardless of which of those 4 that we adapt or that we use, we find that it's important for us to gain access. Now, we're back to the example of the cafeteria. It's easy to gain access because it is a public environment, public space, so I don't need to get special permission to be there. Now, but what if you want to study something that is more private, say how people talk about their daily lives at at dinner time? You know, the example from a book. If say you want to see how families communicate over a meal, that is more private because it might happen or most probably happen at someone's home. So how do you gain access to go into someone's home and observe, to listen in to the conversations that they have at the dinner table? So that's something quite different. So questions that we might want to consider, what will you tell the people that you approach that you want to study? You know, if someone asks you, hey, so why do you want to come to my family or watch us or listen to us talk at the dinner table? There must be some compelling good reasons that you will provide to them before the participants give their consent for you to come to their homes. What will they ask why you want to study them? You know, what's so special about this group of people? You know, is it because of the time, maybe the time that they have dinner, maybe it's the community that they live in, maybe the kind of cuisine or food or background, various reasons. What is the reason, what is a legitimate reason that you want to gain access to that environment? Okay, so we also want to consider alternative ways of gaining access. So what are the other ways? Of course, we're not saying using sneaky ways to find ways to get into people's homes, but what are the other avenues that might help you in this example of studying people around the dinner table? We also have to be very mindful as we gain access to spaces that are private, that we do not invade into people's spaces, to be nosy and listen to private conversations. But really, what is the true intention? And remember, this is given that we are in a course, our intentions are always centered around the communication and the expression and the conveyance of symbols and meanings. Right, continue with gaining access. We might use a covert role. Then you might recall as a covert role that would involve us being a complete participant. But as we understand from what the author tells us, most communication researchers do not use the complete participant approach to collect data because of a number of negative downsides, and those are listed in the relevant section, and we've talked about those previously. So how do we gain access? Coming back to the original question that we have, we might want to consider gatekeepers or sponsors. Okay, so gatekeepers are people who have the credibility, who have the authority to help us gain access into that place or a setting that we want to study. Okay, so they may not necessarily be individuals who are part of that community, but they have the ability to help you appear more credible. Okay, on the flip side, we have sponsors, and sponsors are people who are actually in that environment, who are in that setting, they are part of it, and they sponsor, they help you get access into it. So, for example, maybe say I want to study people who are start conversations at the dinner table again. So a sponsor could be, say, someone who is part of that family, and that person says, okay, I would like you to come to my family and hear what our family talks about at dinner time around the dinner table. So that will be a sponsor. Okay. So as we think about the difficulty and the challenges of gaining access to the the environment or the setting that we want to study, we must also ask ourselves that will our observations provide the data that we want or we need? Is the setting suitable? Can you observe what you want to observe? Will you observation be feasible? And can you observe in such a way that your tactics will not be suspect to others? But we gotta remember, if we are going into a new a private space like the dinner table, we don't want to be so intrusive that people are not comfortable and feel awkward. At the same time, they probably will know, they have to know that you are present, but your presence should not affect them to the extent that everyone is behaving differently, vastly different than how they would be if you were not present. So those are the considerations that we have to be mindful of as we think about gaining access to private spaces, and as we think about how our presence would interfere or affect the communication that happens, or the interactions that would happen at that setting. Because if that were to happen, if we were to interfere and make them behave quite or very differently than how they would before you were present, then that defeats the purpose of studying the participants in their natural setting. So those are questions that we think about, that we have to be mindful. All right, so what are some ways that can help us be familiar with the people and places that we work, that we study, sorry. So one example could be, we want to draw a map of an interactional setting. be interesting to see how people are before and after their conversations around the dinner table. So, for example, say someone or some people who are responsible to prepare the dinner might be in the kitchen, they might be cooking, they might be having their own conversations in there, and the rest of the family might be in their own rooms, or maybe they're all out in the living room watching TV, or maybe they time it such a way that some family members will be stepping in just before dinner starts, things like that. So that could be a way for us to familiarize ourselves of that setting. So maybe you can draw a map. Here's the kitchen. Here's a few individuals preparing the meals, and then the rest of us is in, say, bedroom one, bedroom two, doing their own stuff. Someone might be out on the lawn. Someone might be in the living room watching TV and things like that. Another way that we can familiarize ourselves with a new setting is to ask for a tour. We can ask our participant to take us around, to walk us around the space that we are new to, and ask them to help us see things, see what they observe or what they think are important, what catches their attention, and what they think about before and after the interactions that we want to study. So those are very useful information, background knowledge for us, especially if we are brand new to that setting, and having our participants walk us through the environment, to help us draw a map, to show us things, highlight things, or some interesting features of that setting is very useful to help us be sensitized to what is the key thing, key interactions that we want to study. Okay, so developing trust is very important. Reason because when we try to gain access, people, as we see 2-3 slides ago, when we try to gain access, people will ask, "Oh, okay, so interesting. Why do you want to study this phenomenon? Why do you want to look at this? Why do you want to understand that?" So as they ask those questions, they're essentially wanting to know our motivations, and by sharing, being transparent about our motivations, we help to establish trust. Now, just like your relationships with other people, or with your friends, with your family, we all know that trust is something that's important because it keeps all relationships going. And we know it's difficult to earn and maintain trust, but it's very, very easy to lose trust. And the same thing for research as well. People might take some time to believe in you, to have trust that you have good intentions for what you are studying, but one mistake that you make, or maybe one interpretation of what you did that doesn't square with the motivation that they thought you have, can very quickly eliminate the trust that they have in you, and that can be trust that has been established over a long period of time. So we have to be careful when we think about our trust that we have with our participants. We want to protect it, we want to nourish it, we want to make sure that we are honest, we're transparent with the participants, we earn their trust, and we do what we promise that we will do. It's very important. There's some research that I know they go into a community, they promise this and that, they did certain things, they collected data, they left, and they never talked to the community again. So that's not very good. Reason because then you broke down the relationship, and then it definitely affected the trust that those individuals in that community have with researchers, and that affects future research. So we have to be mindful, be thinking about those things in terms of how we establish and maintain and protect the trust that we have as researchers with our participants. So how do we establish trust? One way that we do is develop rapport, especially with new relationships. We ask simple questions. People love to talk about things that they know well, their expertise. So ask them questions, ask them things that you do not know, and be honest, be authentic, ask them things that you're interested in. Learn about things that people are curious about, people are good in, learn about their names and their titles. Those details are important because they identify, they give them identity. It's important for us to build that rapport, to know our participant, so that it helps as we begin our observation or interviews. Another way that is useful for us as we develop rapport, as we observe our participants, is to locate the key informants. That's the last point. Locating key informants is useful because these informants are kind of the central members in that environment. Who are the key players, so to speak? The key players where when you talk to other participants, they always mention this person, or they always make reference to this person, or hey, you need to talk to this person because she knows this or that, or he has been working here for the longest time. He knows all the inside jokes and gossip and all the most important things. If there is someone like that, the key informant, you might want to interview this person or these people if there are multiple key informants because they are central to the communication networks at that setting. A lot of information passes through them. Either they hear it and they talk to other people, or it originates from them. It's crucial that we tap into that. So that helps us to enrich the data that we collect. Okay, so so far we talked about how we want to gain access, how do we build trust with the participants, and we talked about how we build rapport, especially with participants who are new to us or we are new to them. So with all of that, we think about how do we design a research project, or more specifically, a qualitative research project. Key focus for us is what is the communication phenomenon that we want to study. Okay, what is that important thing that we want to study that will be our focus? Remember that a lot of things can change in qualitative research. We might interview more or less people than we originally thought we would. We might change our focus in terms of the events that we study. Remember earlier we talked about routine events, we talked about special events and untoward events. So those can change or reshape the direction of our study. But ultimately, all of these changes, if there are any, they always point back to that original thought, the research problem that we set out, which is what's the communication phenomenon that we want to study. Now, what informs this phenomenon? What is the context? So we see on the second point, what is the historical, economic, political, and cultural background of the phenomenon? By understanding the context, what is the historical roots that shape the interactions and the way people perceive things in this environment, it helps us have a better insight as we analyze and understand the participants' world, their point of view. And how do we determine what we are observing is the phenomenon? We want to set that clear. We want to think about that before we start to collect the data. Reason because if we do not know, we are unclear. If we're not clear what we want to study, if we are unclear what kind of data will help us answer the question, then we're essentially wasting our time as well as our participants' time. And that's not good. As we know, qualitative research takes up a lot of time and resource, and you don't want to waste precious time and resources on collecting the data and then eventually realizing, oops, didn't really address the questions that we're interested to answer, or it didn't really capture the events that we want to study or analyze. So it's important at the design stage, even though qualitative research is not as linear as quantitative research, there's a lot of wiggle room to change things or adjust things. But at the same time, you want to have a fairly good idea what we want to study and what exactly that we want to collect so that it helps us answer the research questions that we have. Okay, and so where is the physical setting of this phenomenon? If it's at a specific location, say a school or an organization, a family, someone's home, then if it's a physical setting, if it's not in the public space, then we have to gain access. We have to try to gain access into those spaces. So those are thoughts that we have to be thinking about as we design our qualitative research. Okay, so how do we gain access to that? a bit again back to the earliest slide from today's lecture. How do we gain access to that place? How do we gain people's trust? How do we present ourselves? How do we also be honest in our motivations and truly follow through what we promise that we will do or not do? Do we have the time to commit to the project? That's the second question, and it's an important question. Reason because we talk about qualitative research is it takes a lot of time and resource to collect the data, and that's true. And so, if it's very drawn out, it takes over a long period of time. Do we have that time to actually complete it? Collecting the data takes a lot of time, but to analyze it, to break it down, to make sense of it, that's also a lot of time that we have to invest. So, do we have that kind of time and energy to complete the project? Because if we don't have that time and energy to complete the analysis and to make sense of the data we collect, then all that time that we spend designing and collecting the data, they don't go anywhere, and that again is a waste of the researchers' time as well as the participants' precious time. They take time out to talk to you, to share their thoughts, their opinions, their views. Can be very therapeutic, but the ultimate purpose is that we do it as a research endeavor to benefit our understanding of this phenomenon as well as for future researchers, and to be useful for future research as well as people who are in a similar situation. Or do we have the resource to manage the data? Again, if we are collecting a lot of data, do we have enough storage space? If it requires us to have a physical storage space, do we have that? If it requires us to have a cloud these days, everything is online, is electronic. Do we have that enough space? Do we have to buy space, electronic space on the cloud to store data? So things like that we have to be thinking about. Okay, so what can constitute as data in qualitative research? I think we might have talked about this before, but anything that you can capture, anything that you can record, something that allow you to capture it, that can be considered as a qualitative data. So these data can exist in the public sphere or the private sphere. We talk about how data in the public sphere is easier to collect because it's something that's out in the public domain. You don't have to ask or seek special permission to get those. So those can be things like people's tweets that's online, that's available. You just look for someone and you can find that person's tweets, or maybe say YouTube videos. They're openly accessible on the internet. So those are publicly available information or data or material that can count as qualitative data. There can be some private data as well, so those data could be behind some firewall, could be proprietary, collected by some university or organization that they only share with researchers that are affiliated with them. So it can be public or private. Qualitative data is continuous, oftentimes continuous rather than discrete. Reason because it's over a period of time. So as we said about say tweets, so let's say I want to analyze someone's tweets in the last 3 months. So it's over the last 3 months. We can see some pattern, maybe in the way they express ideas, or maybe with the way that they talk about certain things, or the emphasis, the topics that they're interested in. So what did he or she want to express, or what's the emphasis? So it's over a period of time, then we can see perhaps some major themes or major emphasis. Field notes are also another kind of qualitative data. So field notes are notes that we write as we observe a phenomenon. So say in the cafeteria, I'm sitting there as a complete observer. Watching people. I'm taking notes. How many people are there? Who came into the cafeteria? What's the average time they come in? How long did they stay? When did they leave? What's some of the most common items that people buy, or the most favorite beverage that people are drinking that I can observe, so on and so forth. these observations that I make, that I observe, go into my few notes, and they also constitute as a form of qualitative data that I can use. So qualitative can range from anything that's in public, that's in private. It can be anything that we can capture, something that we can record, something that can we observe. All of these can be data, and there is no good or bad data or specific data that we can only use, but anything that we can capture to help us understand or capture or capture or collect to understand the research question, answer it. I mean, those are very good stuff. Here on this slide, what is the impact that we have as researchers? Those would create different biases in how we collect and analyze the data. So that wraps up the end of chapter 15. Right. What is the time frame? We talked about that before. Qualitative research um, takes place over a long period of time. The collection of data, what prior to that is the design, we collect it and then we analyze it. Do we have the time and resource to complete the full project? Do we have the time to commit ourselves to finishing the entire project? That's very important. How are we going to collect the data? So that's the technique. How do we address issues of credibility? Why do people who read your work why do they how do they believe that you are being honest, being authentic and transparent in your motivation, and you actually follow through? How do we gain credibility? How do we establish that? Would our study be informed by a theory, or are we developing theory from our work? So oftentimes we say that qualitative research is oftentimes theory developing. Reason because it's not typically not framed in a certain theory to help us conduct a study. Rather, theory is towards the end of a qualitative research. And how do we acknowledge the biases that we bring to the research? So if there's only one researcher who collects the data, how does this person's ethnic background, sex, age, education, access, how do all of these factors affect this person's view to how this person sees this problem or this phenomenon or the participant? So that's very similar